The Duke had no idea the maid in his mansion was his daughter until this happened. But before starting the video, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It motivates us, and watch this story till the end. Trust me, you won't regret it. Now enjoy the story. Her knees had gone numb an hour ago. That was the only mercy the cold stone floor offered. If you stayed on it long enough, it stopped hurting and simply became part of you. Ilara had learned this in her first week at Ashford Manor. She had learned a great many things in the months since, most of them variations of the same lesson. That a girl with no name worth mentioning could disappear entirely inside a house this large, and no one, not a single soul within these walls, would notice she was gone. It was November. England had turned grey and mean the way it always did by November, the sky pressing low over the moors like a lid being shut on something still breathing. Inside the manor, the fireplaces roared in the rooms that mattered, the Duke's study, the drawing rooms, the long dining hall set each evening for a man who almost never came to the table. The servants' corridors were another country entirely. The cold lived there. It settled into the stone, into the wood, into the thin cotton of Ilara's uniform, and it did not leave. She worked by candlelight at 5 in the morning. She was still working by candlelight at 9 at night. The task tonight was the entrance hall floor, black and white marble, imported immaculate, the kind of floor that showed every footprint and forgave none of them. Ilara moved the brush in long, even strokes, her breath visible in the air before her, her hands raw and reddened at the knuckles where the lye water had cracked the skin again. She did not allow herself to stop. Stopping meant thinking, thinking meant remembering. And remembering meant the inside of a sick room 6 months ago, her mother's hand in hers, her mother's voice already thinning to something barely there, and the face of Harold Voss standing in the doorway behind them both, watching with the patient expression of a man who had already decided what came next. He had waited exactly 4 days after the funeral. "The house is mine," he had said. "The agreement was with your mother, you have no place here." She had been 19 years old. She had had 40 shillings, a carpet bag, and a locket she wore beneath her collar, small, oval, gold-edged, the kind of thing that looked valuable enough to sell but that she had never once considered selling. She did not know where it had come from. Her mother had pressed it into her palm during those last hours and said only, "Keep this. Whatever you do, keep this close." There had been more. Ilara had seen it in her mother's eyes, some gathering of words that never made it out, but then the breathing had changed and then it had stopped, and whatever her mother had meant to say went with her. The locket stayed hidden beneath the collar of every uniform she had worn since. Ashford Manor had not been a choice so much as a door that opened when all the others had closed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldred, was known in 3 counties for running a tight house and asking few questions of girls who arrived with good references and no other options. Ilara had arrived with a forged reference and the kind of face that communicated clearly and without words that she would work without complaint. She had been hired the same afternoon. That had been 7 months ago. In 7 months, she had polished every piece of silver in the house twice. She had learned which floorboards creaked and which could be trusted. She had learned that the Duke, His Grace Edward Ashford, 4th of his name, rose at 6, breakfasted alone, spent his mornings in the East Wing where no maid was permitted without specific instruction, and moved through his own household like a man who had long since made peace with being surrounded by people he did not see. He did not see her, no one did. This was the arrangement. This was how it worked. A girl like Ilara, no family name that meant anything, no connections, no history anyone had thought to record, existed in a house like this the way a shadow exists, present, useful, and entirely dependent on someone else's light. She wrung out the brush, she moved 3 feet to the left, she kept going. Somewhere above her, in the rooms that mattered, the candles burned bright and warm. Down here hers was already guttering. The Duke walked past her every single day and felt nothing. He did not know her name. He did not know her face. He had absolutely no idea that the girl on her knees scrubbing his floors carried something around her neck that would change both of their lives forever. If you want to be here for the moment he finds out, subscribe right now and don't go anywhere. It happened on a Thursday. Ilara would remember that detail later, the specific, unremarkable Thursdayness of it. Not a dramatic morning, not a day that had announced itself with any particular weight. The sky was the same flat gray it had been for a fortnight. The corridors smelled the same beeswax and coal smoke and the faint ghost of last night's dinner. She had been carrying a stack of folded linen down the east corridor, the pile high enough that she navigated mostly by memory. when she turned the corner at the library door and walked directly into the path of His Grace, Edward Ashford, 4th Duke of Ashford. The linen did not fall. She caught it barely, one arm shooting out to brace against the wall while the other locked around the stack with the reflexes of someone who had been dropping things and catching them her entire life. She steadied. She stepped back. She lowered her eyes immediately the way every girl in this house had learned to do within their first week of service. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Her voice was level. That was the thing about Alara. Even at her most rattled, her voice stayed level. It was the one thing Harold Voss had never managed to take from her. She expected him to walk on. That was what they did. The family walked on. The maids became furniture again. It was a transaction so routine it required no acknowledgement from either party. He did not walk on. The Duke stood very still in the corridor and looked at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at young women in service. She knew that look and had learned to navigate around it like a hazard on a road. This was something else entirely, something she had no ready category for. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a painting he has seen before in a different gallery, years ago, certain of recognition, uncertain of the source. His brow had drawn in just slightly. His eyes, gray, precise, the kind of eyes that seemed built for assessment rather than warmth, had gone very still. Alara kept her gaze down. She could feel his looking at her anyway. "What is your name?" The question was quiet, clipped. The Duke was not a man who wasted words, and even this small offering of them seemed to cost him some minor effort, as though he had not entirely planned to speak and was mildly surprised to find that he had. "Alara, Your Grace, I work under Mrs. Aldred in the household." A pause, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, long enough to be strange. "How long have you been in this house?" 7 months, Your Grace." Another pause, shorter this time. He seemed to be deciding something, or perhaps undeciding it. "Carry on," he said. And then he walked on, exactly as she had expected him to from the beginning, down the corridor, through the far door, gone. The sound of his footsteps receded and the corridor returned to its ordinary silence, and Alara stood there for one moment, alone with the linen and the beeswax smell and the peculiar residual sensation of having been seen, truly seen, for the first time in 7 months. She did not know what to do with that feeling, so she folded it away beneath her collar next to the locket and kept walking. Mrs. Aldred had been housekeeper at Ashford Manor for 23 years. In 23 years, she had watched 2 dukes occupy these rooms. She had managed 34 members of staff at the household's peak. She had navigated 3 periods of financial strain, one near scandal involving a visiting earl, and the quiet, devastating year after the late Duchess died, when the manor had gone so still inside that it felt less like a home and more like a held breath. She was not a woman given to imagination or to sentiment. She noticed things because it was her function to notice things, and she catalogued what she noticed with the same precise efficiency she applied to the silver inventory or the quarterly linen count. She had been at the far end of the corridor when it happened. She had seen the Duke stop. She had seen his face. In 23 years, she had never seen Edward Ashford look at anyone the way he looked at that girl in the corridor. Not with desire, not with suspicion, with something far more unsettling than either. With recognition. Mrs. Aldred stood very still after he had gone and looked at the space where Alara had been standing. Then she looked at the door through which the Duke had disappeared. Then she looked down at her own hands, folded neatly at her waist, and she thought about something she had not permitted herself to think about in a very long time. She thought about a night 19 years ago, a letter that had come and then been taken away, a name that had been spoken once in this house and then, very deliberately, never spoken again. She said nothing. She returned to her duties, but she began, quietly and carefully, to watch. Lady Constance Ashford occupied the west wing of the manor with the settled authority of a woman who believed that physical proximity to a title was the next best thing to holding it herself. She was the widow of the Duke's younger brother, dead 4 years now, leaving Constance with a modest income, a son of 12 whose prospects depended almost entirely on his uncle's continued goodwill, and an appetite for relevance that the modest income did nothing to satisfy. She had installed herself in the West Wing in the first month of her widowhood, and proceeded to make it permanent with the quiet, systematic efficiency of ivy taking a wall. The Duke tolerated her presence the way he tolerated most things he could not immediately resolve, with silence and distance. She had been crossing the upper gallery on Thursday morning when she looked down through the arched windows into the east corridor below. She saw Edward stop. She saw him look at the maid. Constance was a woman of many cultivated talents, but her most reliable was this: she could identify a threat before it had identified itself. It was the skill that had kept her son's position secure. Standing in the gallery on that unremarkable Thursday morning, watching her brother-in-law's face go through some quiet, private reckoning over a girl carrying linen, a girl Constance had never bothered to look at directly, which she now recognized as a failure of attention she would not repeat, she felt the cold, familiar thread of it move through her chest. Something was wrong. She did not know yet what it was. She did not have the pieces. But in her experience, the pieces always came, and it was far better to begin preparing before they arrived than to scramble after they had already assembled themselves into something she could not undo. She turned from the window. She walked back to the west wing with her usual composure, her expression arranged in its usual pleasant neutrality. But her mind was already moving. The girl's name, she would learn, was Alara. She had no family name that anyone in the house could confirm. She had come with references vetted personally by Mrs. Aldred. She had been in the house 7 months. She was unremarkable in every measurable respect. And yet, Edward had stopped. Constance sat down at her writing desk, opened the second drawer, and removed a small locked box she kept beneath her correspondence. She held the key for a moment without using it. Then she locked the box away again and rang for her personal maid. There was no immediate danger, she was almost certain of that. Almost was not a word Constance Ashford permitted herself to be comfortable with. The library at Ashford Manor had not been properly catalogued in 11 years. This was, by any reasonable measure, not a maid's problem. The library was not on Alara's assigned rotation. It belonged to a different girl, Martha, 16, who dusted the shelves on Tuesdays and Fridays with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had been taught that books were objects and had never been given reason to think otherwise. She had not been assigned the library. She had simply noticed, on a Tuesday morning when Martha was confined to bed with a fever, that no one else had been sent to cover it. And Alara, who had spent 7 months learning that the surest way to remain useful was to notice what was being missed, had picked up the dusting cloth and gone in. She had not expected to stay for an hour. The room was extraordinary. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, interrupted only by a pair of tall windows looking out over the frozen formal gardens, and the morning light came through them at an angle that caught the gold lettering on the older spines and made them glow like something lit from within. Alara began dusting. She began at the left wall, working top to bottom on the section she could reach from the rolling ladder, and she did not intend to read anything. She truly did not. But the titles were there, and she had been reading since she was 5 years old, and some habits are stronger than discipline. De natura rerum, she murmured to herself, running the cloth along the spine. Lucretius on the nature of things. She moved along the shelf. Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Caesar's own account. Inflated, her mother used to say. Caesar was the first man in history to write his own press. She smiled without meaning to. Metamorphoses. Ovid. She reached the next section, tilted her head at a slim dark-spined volume with no visible title on its cover. She pulled it gently from the shelf, opened the first page. Latin, an inscription in the front, to E.A. who will read this properly, unlike his father, with affection and exasperation, H.M. That was a gift from my tutor, said a voice behind her. I was 12, he was not wrong about my father. Alara spun. The book nearly went with her. She caught it, pressed it against her chest, and found the Duke standing 4 feet away with his coat still on and a set of papers under one arm. He had come in from outside. She had heard nothing over the sound of her own voice filling the room, and his expression was doing the same thing it had done in the corridor a week ago. Hat particular stillness, that look she still had no proper name for. She was aware, acutely, that she had been speaking Latin in his library without permission. "Your Grace," she set the book down immediately. "I apologize, Martha is unwell and I didn't want the room to go unattended. I should not have, I was only dusting, I'll finish and leave directly." "You read Latin." It was not a question, his tone was not accusatory, it was simply precise, as though he were cataloging a fact and wished to confirm its accuracy before filing it. Alara hesitated, lying seemed both pointless and insulting. "Yes, Your Grace, my mother taught me, she had been a governess before she married." "And your father?" The question landed quietly, she felt it anyway. "I didn't know my father, Your Grace." A pause. She watched him register this without reaction, or rather with the particular quality of non-reaction that she was beginning to understand was his version of being affected by something. He set the papers on the reading desk. He did not tell her to leave. "Finish the dusting," he said. "The south wall wants attention, it hasn't been done properly in months." He sat down, opened his papers, and said nothing else. Alara finished the dusting. She did not speak again. Neither did he. But when she reached the door 20 minutes later, she heard, without turning around, the quiet sound of him pulling a book from the shelf she had been working on, and she had the strange, disorienting sense of having passed some kind of examination she had not known she was sitting. The ledger error announced itself on a Wednesday. Alara had been summoned to help Mrs. Aldred with the quarterly household accounts. Two of the other girls were down with the same fever that had taken Martha, and the housekeeper needed a second pair of eyes on the column additions before she presented them to the estate manager. It was not a task typically given to junior maids. Mrs. Aldred had given it to Alara with the brisk, unsentimental manner of a woman who had simply identified the correct tool for the job and was not interested in making a ceremony of it. Alara sat at the housekeeper's table and worked through the columns in silence. She found the error on the third page. "Mrs. Aldred," she kept her voice neutral, "the coal account, October through December, 3 years running, the quarterly figure doesn't match the monthly sum. Someone transposed 2 digits in the winter total, it's been carrying forward ever since." Mrs. Aldred came to stand behind her, looked at the column, and was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be significant. "So it has," she said finally. "It's a small difference each quarter, easy to miss if you're checking totals rather than working back through the monthly figures." "Yes," another pause. "How much has it accumulated?" Alara had already done the calculation. She turned the ledger slightly so Mrs. Aldred could see the number she had written in the margin. Mrs. Aldred looked at it, then she looked at Alara. The housekeeper's face was composed and unreadable in the way of someone who had spent decades mastering composed unreadability, but something moved behind it, some small recalibration, the way a compass needle moves when it finds north. "Well," said Mrs. Aldred, "thank you, Alara." She said it simply. She did not make it more than it was, but the following Monday Alara's assigned duties were quietly reorganized. The 4 a.m. floor duty was removed from her rotation. She was moved from laundry, the hardest physical work in the house, to correspondence sorting and household inventory. Her workday still began early and ended late, because that was the nature of service and it applied to everyone. But the particular cruelty of her original assignments, the ones that left her hands cracked and her knees aching by nightfall, had been gently, efficiently removed. No one said why, no announcement was made. These things were simply different now. Alara understood with the instincts of someone who had learned to read rooms and silences and small adjustments, that the order had not come from Mrs. Aldred. She did not speak of it, she did not know what she would have said. The conversation happened on a Friday afternoon in the corridor outside the kitchen, perhaps the least romantic setting possible for the most charged exchange Alara had experienced in recent memory. But she was beginning to understand that nothing about this situation was inclined to follow conventional arrangements. The Duke had come down to the lower floor himself. This alone was unusual enough that the kitchen maid had nearly dropped an entire pot of soup upon seeing him in the doorway. He had come, it seemed, specifically for Alara, who was in the corridor with the inventory ledger, counting the linen cupboard, and who looked up to find him standing there with that same expression and the same deliberate economy of movement that seemed to characterize everything about him. "You've been reassigned," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Is the new arrangement satisfactory?" Alara regarded him for a moment. He was asking her a genuine question, not rhetorical, not performative. He wanted to know the answer. She could have said yes, Your Grace, thank you, Your Grace, and returned to the linen count, and they both could have continued the polite fiction that nothing unusual was occurring. She knew how to do that. She had been doing that her entire life. Instead, she said, "May I ask why the change was made?" His expression did not shift. "The household assignments are at my discretion." "Of course, I only ask because I'd prefer to understand what I've done to merit the adjustment so that I can continue doing it." She paused, "Or correct it if that's what's needed." "You corrected an accounting error that had gone unnoticed for 3 years. That was Mrs. Aldred's determination to make, Your Grace, not mine." "Nevertheless," he looked at her steadily, "you have been given the duties appropriate to your abilities. That is not charity, it is efficiency. There is a distinction." There it was. He had said it before she could, the word she had been circling in her own head for a week, the word that had made the reassignment sit uneasily alongside the gratitude she also felt for it. Charity. He was preempting her objection. He was doing it with a precision that suggested he had understood exactly what her objection would be. Alara felt something she hadn't expected, a grudging, involuntary respect. "Then I thank you for the efficiency," she said, "Your Grace." The faintest thing crossed his face, not a smile. She did not think this man produced smiles easily or often, but something adjacent to one, something that arrived at the edges and did not quite commit to the center. "You're welcome," he said, and left. Alara stood alone in the corridor with the linen ledger and the distinct, unsettling awareness that whatever was happening in this house, whatever quiet and inexplicable current was running beneath the surface of things, it was not moving in any direction she had anticipated. Mrs. Aldred appeared at the far end of the corridor 30 seconds later. She had the look of someone who had not been standing there for the duration of that conversation, presented with a degree of commitment that confirmed absolutely that she had. She met Alara's eyes briefly, said nothing, returned to the kitchen. But that evening, after the dinner service, Alara found a small pot of hand salve on the windowsill of her room, good quality, the kind used upstairs rather than in the servants' quarters, with no note attached and no explanation offered. She held it for a moment in both hands. Then she pressed it to her collar just above the locket, the way she did sometimes when she needed to remind herself that something real was there. The letter arrived on a Saturday. It came in with the morning post, which Alara sorted as part of her new duties. Most of it was routine, estate correspondence, an invoice from a London supplier, a note from a neighboring family regarding a proposed shooting arrangement for December. The letter was at the bottom of the stack. The handwriting on the outside was formal and precise. The return address was a solicitor's office in London, a firm whose name Alara did not recognize. It was addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ashford, personal, urgent. She logged it. She delivered it to the study door along with the rest of the post, knocked twice, heard the single word of acknowledgement from within, and left the stack on the side table as she always did. She was 3 corridors away when she heard, faintly, the study door close. Not the casual click of a door being shut behind a person in motion. The deliberate, quiet sound of a door being closed by someone who had just read the first line of something and needed, suddenly and without warning, to be alone. Alara did not stop walking. She had no reason to stop walking. She continued to the linen cupboard, completed the inventory, returned the ledger to Mrs. Aldred's office, and went about the remainder of her day with the focused, careful efficiency that had kept her employed and safe and invisible for 7 months. But the sound of that door stayed with her. The way certain sounds do. The way certain sounds lodge themselves somewhere behind the sternum and simply remain there, patient and quiet, waiting for you to understand what they mean. That letter changed everything in this house. The Duke read it alone behind a closed door, and when he emerged, something in him had shifted, something that Alara, still invisible, still unknowing, could not yet see, but you and I can feel it coming. If you've ever been kept from something that was always yours, stay with this story. The truth is still making its way to the surface. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the moment it arrives. We are no. Tea done yet? The Duke did not emerge from his study until evening. The dinner bell rang, the household assembled, served, cleared. The Duke's place at the table was set and remained untouched. Mrs. Aldred sent a tray up at 7:30. It came back untouched. On Tuesday, he reappeared in the East Corridor at his usual hour, moving with his usual controlled efficiency, his face arranged in its usual precise composure. He looked, to any observer, entirely unchanged. Alara, sorting correspondence in the room adjacent, glanced at him through the open door for exactly 2 seconds. Her mother had taught her, by example rather than instruction, that the people who appeared the most composed were often the ones carrying the heaviest unseen weight, and that the weight revealed itself not in expressions or words but in the body's small involuntary tells. The set of the shoulders, the pace of movement, the way a person's hands behaved when they thought no one was looking. The Duke's hands, passing the corridor doorway at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, were absolutely still at his sides. Too still. The stillness of someone who had decided, with great deliberate effort, that they would be still. Alara returned to the correspondence. She said nothing, she thought about it all day. Lady Constance had not been idle. In the 10 days since the Thursday corridor incident, she had compiled everything available to her about the girl called Alara. She had done it carefully, through channels that could not be traced back to her directly. A word to the laundry girl who was easily flattered, a question slipped into an otherwise unremarkable conversation with the junior footman, a brief and seemingly casual inquiry to the village seamstress who supplied the household uniforms and who knew, as all seamstresses did, considerably more about the people she dressed than they ever suspected. The results were thin, frustratingly thin. The girl had arrived 7 months ago. She had come from the South Hampshire, possibly, or the borders of Wiltshire. Her mother had recently died. She had no surviving family she had mentioned. Her references had been provided through a domestic agency in Winchester, which meant they had been vetted at arm's length and would be difficult to examine without appearing to look for something specific. She worked quietly and well. She kept to herself. She wore a locket beneath her collar that she never removed and never spoke of. The locket. Constance sat at her writing desk on the Tuesday morning and turned this detail over with the careful attention of a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. A locket, hidden, never removed, never spoken of, given the treatment of something that mattered enormously to its owner while simultaneously being kept out of sight. Not vanity, not sentimentality, protection. The girl was protecting it. Constance unlocked the box in her second drawer. Inside were 3 items she had kept for 19 years. A letter, a legal document, and a small folded paper on which she had once copied, in her own handwriting, a description she had read in a longer document before destroying that longer document entirely. The description was of a piece of jewelry, a gold-edged locket, oval with a specific engraving on the back, a name, a date, and a phrase in Latin that Constance had not been able to read at the time but had copied faithfully nonetheless. She looked at the paper now. She thought about a girl who read Latin in libraries without permission. She thought about Edward's face in the corridor. She thought about the solicitor's letter, because of course she knew about the solicitor's letter. She had known it was coming for 3 weeks, because the same solicitor had written to her first 8 months ago, inquiring with professional delicacy whether she had any knowledge of a record of birth that the firm had recently been engaged to locate. She had written back pleasantly and helpfully and entirely without the information they were seeking, and she had assumed that would be the end of it. Apparently it was not the end of it. Apparently Edward now knew, or knew something, enough to spend a weekend in his study behind a closed door. Constance locked the box. She rose from her desk. She moved to her window and looked out over the frost-pale grounds for a long moment, thinking with the particular cold clarity she reserved for situations that required it. The girl needed to be gone, not damaged, not destroyed. Constance was not a cruel woman, she would not have said, and cruelty of that kind left traces, but removed, discredited in a way that required her departure and made her return unlikely. Something clean, something that could not come back. She moved to her writing desk and rang for her personal maid. She had a plan by afternoon. The accusation came on Wednesday. Allura was in the upper corridor outside the guest rooms when it happened, and it happened the way these things always happen when they have been carefully arranged, which is to say that it happened in front of witnesses and with an air of shocked discovery that was, on reflection, slightly too complete to be genuine. Lady Constance's personal maid, a narrow-faced woman named Birch who had worked for Constance for 6 years and had absorbed, in that time, something of her mistress's particular talent for useful timing, came around the corner from the direction of the guest suite with the expression of someone who had just found a dead thing in an unexpected location. "There she is," Birch said, not to Allura, to the 2 footmen who had apparently been walking with her, which was itself unusual since Birch did not typically require an escort. "I saw her coming out of Lady Constance's sitting room not 40 minutes ago. I thought nothing of it, I thought she'd been sent to clean. But when I went back in, her ladyship's garnet brooch was gone from the dressing table." The footman looked at Allura. Allura looked at Birch. In the 3 seconds that followed, she understood exactly what was happening with a clarity that was almost clean in its precision. The way a very cold morning is clarifying, the way certain kinds of pain are clarifying. And she felt, moving through that clarity like weather, the old familiar composite of outrage and exhaustion and the particular grief of recognizing that the world was doing, once again, exactly what the world had always done to girls like her. She had not been inside Lady Constance's sitting room. She had not touched a brooch. She had been, for the entirety of the morning, in the upper corridor and the linen cupboard and, briefly, the correspondence room where Mrs. Aldred could confirm her presence if anyone thought to ask. None of this, she understood, would matter unless she was given the opportunity to say it to someone who was inclined to listen. "I haven't been inside Lady Constance's rooms today," she said. Her voice was level. She held the level. "I've been on the upper corridor rotation since 6 this morning," Mrs. Aldred assigned it. "I know what I saw," Birch said, with the flat confidence of someone reciting a rehearsed line. "Then what you saw was mistaken." Birch's eyes narrowed slightly. This was not, apparently, the response she had been prepared for. Within the hour, Allura was standing in the Duke's study. It was her first time inside the room. She registered it peripherally, the shelves, the correspondence stacked with the same slightly neglected quality she had noticed in the library, the fire burning lower than it should because someone had forgotten to send the footman up, the reading desk with the solicitor's letter no longer visible but the space where it had sat somehow still present in the way that absences sometimes are. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned when the door closed. Lady Constance was there, seated in the chair to the left of the fireplace with the composed concern of someone performing sorrow on behalf of a situation they found privately gratifying. Birch stood near the door. One of the footmen remained outside in the corridor. Mrs. Aldred was also there. This last detail Allura had not expected. The housekeeper stood near the far wall with her hands folded and her face entirely unreadable, and she looked at Allura when she entered with a gaze that contained, Allura thought, something that was not accusation and was not quite reassurance but was in the territory of both. The Duke looked at Allura. "You understand the nature of the accusation," he said, not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." "Lady Constance's brooch, a garnet piece set in gold, is missing from her sitting room. Her maid has stated that she saw you leaving that room this morning." "I wasn't in that room this morning, Your Grace." "Birch is quite certain," Constance said from her chair. Her voice was gentle, regretful, the voice of a woman who took no pleasure in any of this. She had, Allura thought, considerable talent. "I'm afraid this is not the first time items have gone missing when—" "That's not true," Allura said. A silence fell that had a specific texture, the texture of a room full of people who were not accustomed to being interrupted by junior maids and were recalibrating accordingly. Constance's expression arranged itself into something more careful. I beg your pardon. You said this is not the first time items have gone missing. I'm asking you to name a specific item on a specific occasion that you believe I took. Alara kept her voice entirely steady. She kept her eyes on the Duke, not on Constance. Because if such an occasion exists, I would like the opportunity to account for my whereabouts at that time. And if it doesn't exist, I would ask that the statement not be made as though it does. Another silence, longer. Constance said nothing because there was no specific occasion. There were no missing items before th. Is morning. The statement had been an embellishment, the kind that seems safe to add in the moment and becomes treacherous the instant it is directly challenged by someone who knows it is false and is not afraid to say so. The Duke had not moved. He was watching Alara with that expression again, the still, assessing, particular expression that she had now seen 3 times and still could not name. Where were you this morning, he asked, from 6 o'clock. Alara told him. She told him precisely in order with the times she could confirm and the tasks she could name and the fact that Mrs. Aldred had assigned the upper corridor rotation and had seen her there at 7:30 when she came to check the linen inventory. When she finished, the Duke looked at Mrs. Aldred. Mrs. Aldred confirmed it without inflection, every detail. Constance's expression had not changed. It was a disciplined face, Alara granted her that. But something had shifted beneath it, some slight tightening around the eyes, the recalculation of a person who had expected a different kind of girl and was adjusting her strategy in real time. Birch is certain of what she saw, Constance said again calmly. I don't suggest the girl took it deliberately necessarily. Perhaps she picked it up without thinking. Perhaps she meant to return it. In any case, the brooch is missing and... Your Grace. Alara spoke quietly. She was aware that she was about to do something that could not be undone. She was aware that the correct behavior, the safe, expected, time-honored behavior, was to lower her eyes, to be grateful for the partial defense that Mrs. Aldred's confirmation had already provided, and to allow the Duke to reach his own conclusions from the evidence that existed. She was also aware that the correct behavior had never once, in her entire 19 years, produced anything she would describe as justice. I didn't take the brooch, she said. I wasn't in that room. I have no history of theft and no reason to begin one now. I have a position here that I depend on, and I would not risk it for a piece of jewelry I have no way of selling without being immediately identified as its source. What I am telling you is the truth, all of it. And I understand that I am a maid with no family name and no one beyond Mrs. Aldred who can speak to my character, and that Lady Constance is family to you, and that the weight of this room is not arranged in my favor. She paused. Let that sit for exactly 1 breath. I'm telling you the truth anyway. The study was very quiet. The fire had burned down to its embers. The wind pushed once against the window glass and was still. The Duke looked at her for a long time. Lady Constance was also looking at her, and the expression on Constance's face had finally, almost imperceptibly, shifted from composed concern into something more honest and considerably less pleasant. Not anger, something colder than anger, the look of a woman who had set a careful trap and watched the quarry step directly over it and keep walking. The brooch will be found, the Duke said finally. His voice was even, conclusive. Mrs. Aldred, have the sitting room searched thoroughly. Check the dressing table drawers, the floor behind the furniture, and the pockets of any garments that have been moved for cleaning. Mrs. Aldred nodded once. Yes, Your Grace. Alara, he said her name with the same precise neutrality he applied to everything, and yet the fact that he used it, her actual name, rather than the girl or she, registered somewhere in her chest like a struck note. Return to your duties. She curtsied, she moved to the door. She was almost through it when Constance spoke behind her, voice still perfectly gentle, perfectly controlled. Edward, you cannot simply. The matter is concluded until evidence suggests otherwise, the Duke said. Constance. One word, her name, said the way you say the name of a door you are closing. Illyria walked back into the corridor, past the waiting footman, and continued down the hall with her spine straight and her hands steady and the locket pressing warm against her collarbone through the cotton of her uniform. She did not stop walking until she reached the linen cupboard, which was the smallest room on the floor and the only one she could reasonably be alone in. She stepped inside. She closed the door. She stood in the dark between the shelves of pressed cotton and breathed once, twice, slowly, and let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of what had just happened. The trap, the witnesses, the false statement Constance had tried to embed in the record, the room arranged against her. And the choice she had made inside that room, the same choice she always made, the only choice she seemed constitutionally incapable of not making, no matter the cost. To tell the truth plainly and entirely and let it stand without decoration or apology or performance of helplessness. Hey. Our mother had called it stubbornness. Illyria had always suspected it was something else, something older and less negotiable than stubbornness. Something that lived in the same place as the locket, close to the center, beneath everything, impossible to remove. She allowed herself the 30 seconds. Then she straightened, opened the cupboard door, and walked back into the corridor. The brooch was discovered late that afternoon, in the gap between the cushion and the arm of the very chair in which Constance sat each morning, which was where small items that had not been taken by anyone went when they fell, as small items are apt to do, without assistance. No announcement was made, no apology was offered. But that evening, a pot of good tea appeared outside Illyria's door alongside a dish of shortbread that was usually reserved for the family floor. And in the west wing, behind a closed door, Lady Constance sat alone at her desk and accepted for the first time the serious, unpleasant possibility that this was not going to be as simple as she had planned. The girl had spine, and the Duke had watched her use it with an expression that Constance had finally found a name for. Not recognition. Pride. The second accusation was better prepared. Constance had learned from the first one. She had learned that improvised embellishments collapse under direct questioning, that witnesses who can be confirmed are worth 10 who cannot, and that a girl with a level voice and a willingness to speak plainly in a room full of people who outrank her is a more formidable opponent than she had initially calculated. She did not make the same mistake twice. She was not, had never been, a woman who made the same mistake twice. This time she had evidence. It arrived in the form of a letter, presented to the Duke on a Friday morning, 3 days after the brooch incident, written in a hand that Illyria did not recognize and signed by a name she had never heard. A former employer, the letter claimed. A household in Winchester where a girl matching Illyria's precise description had worked for 4 months 2 years ago and had been dismissed without reference following the disappearance of a silver candlestick, and a sum of money from the household accounts. The letter was detailed, it was specific. It named dates, described the candlestick, noted the amount missing from the accounts to the precise shilling. It was, from first word to last, entirely fabricated. Illyria knew this because she had never worked in Winchester. She had never been to Winchester. 2 years ago she had been in her mother's house in Hampshire, nursing her mother through the first winter of the illness that would eventually take her. And the only people who could confirm this were a local apothecary who might or might not remember her and Harold Voss, who would say whatever served Harold Voss. She stood in the Duke's study for the second time and looked at the letter he held across the desk and understood, with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has fought this battle before in different rooms with different furniture, that the world had decided to collect what it was owed. "I have never worked in Winchester," she said. "I have never been to Winchester. 2 years ago I was caring for my mother in Hampshire." "Can you confirm that?" The Duke's voice was careful, the voice of a man trying very hard to be fair in a situation that was not designed to accommodate fairness. "The apothecary in Barton Village may remember me. My mother purchased medicines regularly and I collected them." She paused. "I have no other witnesses." "The letter is signed and dated." "The letter is false." The Duke set it down on the desk. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his forehead, a gesture she had never seen from him, small and involuntary, the gesture of a man experiencing something he did not have a prepared response for. Then he composed himself. He was very good at composing himself. It was, she thought, both his greatest strength and the thing that must cost him the most. Lady Constance was not in the room this time. She had been clever enough to understand that her presence at the first confrontation had revealed her hand. She had submitted the letter through the estate manager and positioned herself at a distance, concerned, reluctant, hoping the matter would resolve itself without her needing to be involved. Only the estate manager stood to one side and Mrs. Aldred, and the cold morning light coming through the study windows at an angle that seemed to find everything it touched and render it harsher than it was. The magistrate in the village, the estate manager said, not unkindly, would need to be informed if the accusation from the Winchester household is. I understand, Alara said. She did understand, that was the thing, she understood completely. A letter with specific details from a named employer combined with the brooch incident 3 days prior, which had been resolved in her favor but which now would be recast in any telling as a near miss, constituted the kind of record that magistrates found persuasive. She had no counter-evidence. She had no family. She had no name that meant anything in this county or any other. She had her word, and her word was the word of a maid with an accusation already on her recent history, against a document that looked entirely official and probably cost Constance's contacts in London no more than an afternoon and a few careful lies. She was going to lose. She could feel it in the room the way you feel weather coming before it arrives, in the pressure, in the quality of the silence, in the way the estate manager was not meeting her eyes, and the way the Duke was meeting them with an expression of such controlled conflict that looking at him directly felt like looking at something private. He did not want this. She could see that. It was perhaps the only thing she could see clearly, that whatever was happening behind his composure, it was not indifference. He was hesitating. He was genuinely, visibly hesitating, which meant that some part of him did not believe the letter or did not want to believe it, or was trying to find a way through this that did not end with her handed to the magistrate on the basis of a document he could not immediately disprove. But he was a duke, and she was a maid, and the letter existed. And society had arrangements for exactly this situation, and those arrangements did not leave much room for a man in his position to simply decide on the basis of instinct and a girl's steady voice that the letter was a lie. The estate manager cleared his throat gently. Your Grace, he said, given the circumstances, I think. No. The word came from the far wall. Everyone in the room turned. Mrs. Aldred had not moved from her position. She stood exactly where she had stood since the beginning of this meeting, hands folded, back straight, face composed. She looked from a distance precisely the same as she always looked. But her voice, when she had spoken that single word, had contained something that Alara had never heard in it before. Not volume, not anger. Weight. The weight of something that had been carried for a very long time and had just been set down. Mrs. Aldred, the estate manager said, with the polite surprise of a man who was not accustomed to being interrupted by housekeepers. She did not look at him, she looked at the Duke. Your Grace, she said, before this proceeds further I need to speak. I should have spoken before now. I have been aware of that for some time. She paused. The pause was not uncertain. It was the pause of a woman organizing what she intended to say with the same precision she brought to everything, making sure it would be said in the right order and without gaps that could be filled by other people's interpretations. What I am about to tell you will cost me my position in this house. I understand that. I am telling you anyway. The Duke looked at her. He said nothing. He was very still. 19 years ago, Mrs. Aldred said, before I came to Ashford Manor, I worked as a midwife in Hampshire. It was my profession before I entered household service. I delivered many children in those years. I kept records. It was my practice. It was the practice my own teacher had instilled in me, and I maintained it without exception. She reached into the pocket of her dress and removed a small notebook. Old, its cover worn smooth at the corners, the kind of object that had been carried for so long it had become part of the person carrying it. On the 14th of March, in a small house outside Barton Village in Hampshire, I delivered a child to a woman named Catherine Moore. The birth was difficult. The mother survived. The child, a girl, survived also. The room was absolutely silent. Catherine Moore, Mrs. Aldred continued, her voice unchanged, had been until 8 months prior to that birth employed as a companion and private correspondent to a family of some distinction. She had left that employment under circumstances she did not explain to me. She was alone, she had very little. She asked me after the birth was over to record the child's name in my register. She opened the notebook to a page near the back. I did. She held it out, the Duke crossed the room and took it from her. Ilara watched him look at the page. She watched the color leave his face. It did not happen dramatically. There was no theatrical moment of collapse. It happened the way genuine shock happens to a person who has spent decades learning to contain themselves. Quietly, internally, a slow draining of something that had been maintaining the surface until the surface was still there, but what lay beneath it had been entirely rearranged. His hands holding the notebook were not still. The child's name as recorded, Mrs. Aldred said quietly, is Ilara Catherine Moore, born 14th of March. Father's name, she paused for only a half-second, listed at the mother's request as Edward Ashford. No one in the room breathed. Ilara stood very still and felt the world she had understood, the world of lye water and stone floors and invisible labor and 40 shillings in a carpet bag, and a locket she had never been able to explain, cracked cleanly down the middle like ice giving way underfoot, and beneath it not water but something else. Something that had been there the whole time. Something she had no words for yet because she had never been given reason to need them. She thought of her mother's hand, the way it had pressed the locket into her palm, the words that had gathered and then not come, the thing her mother had been trying to say. She had been trying to tell her. With the last of what she had been trying to tell her. That is not possible, the estate manager said, with the tone of a man who knew, even as he said it, that it was. Mrs. Aldred looked at him calmly. I have the original register, which I am prepared to submit to any legal examination. I have a letter from Catherine Moore, written to me 6 months after the birth, which I kept because, she stopped briefly, and this was the only moment in which something other than composure moved across her face, something old and carefully maintained and now released, because I believed it would matter one day. I have kept these things for 19 years. I kept them because what was done to that child was wrong, and I could not prove it was wrong at the time, and I could not act on it without evidence, and so I kept the evidence and I waited. You waited, the Duke said. His voice was not angry, it was something more complicated than anger. Something that had anger in it alongside a great many other things that had not yet sorted themselves into an order he could manage. Yes, Mrs. Aldred held his gaze. I am sorry for that, Your Grace. I told myself that acting too soon without understanding the full situation would do more harm than good. I told myself that when the time came I would know it. She glanced at Ilara, briefly, directly, and with an expression that Ilara would carry with her for the rest of her life. The time has come. Ilara looked at this woman who had delivered her into the world and then watched her scrub its floors for 7 months without saying a word. And she understood, not immediately, but in the way you understand things that are too large to take in all at once, that the silence had not been indifference. It had been the terrible, loving caution of someone who had one piece of evidence and one chance to use it, and could not afford to spend it until the moment was right. Mrs. Aldred had been waiting for the moment when Ilara needed it most. The moment was now. She had chosen correctly. The estate manager was saying something about verification, about legal process, about the need to confirm the documents before any conclusions could be drawn, and the Duke was listening with the surface attention of a man whose deeper attention was entirely elsewhere, and Constance's letter lay on the desk between them, and none of the mechanisms of the room and its ordinary management seemed remotely relevant to anything that was actually happening. Ilara reached up. She did it slowly, without drama, because she was not a person who performed things. She unfastened the top button of her collar. She reached beneath the cotton. She lifted the locket out into the light for the first time since her mother had given it to her, the first time it had been visible to anyone, the first time she had permitted it to exist in the world rather than against her skin in the dark. It was small, gold-edged, oval, warm from her body. There was an engraving on the back that she had traced with her thumb 1,000 times without knowing what it said because the letters were small and she had never had enough light. She held it out to the Duke. He looked at it for a long moment without taking it, then he took it, he turned it over, he read the back. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked at her, really looked at her, without the composure, without the assessment, without the controlled, careful distance he maintained between himself and everything that mattered to him, and Alara saw, for the first time, what was underneath all of it. She saw a man who had lost someone, who had been losing her, in one way or another, for 19 years. Who was only now beginning to understand what else he had lost alongside her. The estate manager had stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the moors and pressed against the glass, and the last of the morning light shifted, and somewhere in the west wing of the house a door opened and then closed, and Lady Constance, who had been listening from the corridor with her hand flat against the wall, understood that everything she had worked to prevent had happened anyway. She stood in the corridor alone. And for the first time in 19 years, she had no plan. Mrs. Aldred had not wept. She stood in the Duke's study with her hands folded and her face composed, and she accepted, quietly and without flinching, the full weight of what she had just done, the position she had surrendered, the security she had spent 23 years building in this house, the future she had imagined for herself here that would now need to be imagined differently. She had known this was the cost. She had known it from the moment she saw the Duke's face in the corridor 3 weeks ago and understood, with the certainty of a woman who had looked at that face in a small notebook for 19 years, that the time she had been waiting for had arrived. She did not regret it. This was the truest thing she knew about herself at this moment, and it surprised her with its cleanness, the absence of regret where she had expected to find at least some small residue of it. She had told the truth. She had given the girl what she had been keeping for her. Whatever came next, that part was done and it was right. The Duke was looking at her. "Why did you come to this house?" he asked. "After the birth, why Ashford Manor specifically?" Mrs. Aldred held his gaze. "Because Catherine Moore asked me to. She wrote to me in that letter I mentioned. She said she wanted someone who knew the truth to be near the child's father, someone who could act if the time came." She paused. "She did not know, I think, that she would not have the time herself. She believed she would find a way to tell you. She was still hoping in that letter that she would find a way." Something moved across the Duke's face that was too private to look at directly. Alara looked at the locket in his hand instead. "The engraving," she said, her voice was steady. She was proud of it distantly, the way you are proud of a thing that performs well under conditions it was not designed for. "On the back, I've never been able to read it properly. Will you tell me what it says?" The Duke looked down at the locket. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Semper ad te, always toward you." He said it the way a person says something they have said before, something worn smooth with repetition, said in private, in rooms no one else had access to. Alara nodded. She did not trust her voice for anything more than the nod. She stood in the wreckage of the life she had understood and breathed the cold, study air and felt the locket's absence from her collarbone like a new kind of weight. And she thought that this was perhaps what it felt like to be at the very bottom, not the bottom of despair as she had expected, but the bottom of not knowing. The last moment before the shape of things became clear, the moment just before. She had been here before. She was not afraid of it. She reached out her hand, and the Duke placed the locket back into it, and their hands did not quite touch, and the fire needed tending. And outside the moors were cold and pale and enormous under a sky that had finally, in the last hour, begun to clear. The Duke called the gathering for 3 o'clock. He did not call it immediately. He spent the morning in his study with the door closed and Mrs. Aldred's notebook and Catherine Moore's letter and the locket, and he saw no one, and no one was sent to see him. The household moved around his silence the way water moves around a stone, carefully, with an awareness of what it was working around even when it could not name the shape of it. Alara was given, quietly and without explanation, the use of the small sitting room off the east corridor. A fire was lit. Tea was brought. The junior maid who brought it looked at Alara with an expression of wide, uncertain curiosity and then looked away and did not ask any of the questions that were clearly assembling themselves behind her eyes. Alara sat by the fire and held the locket and did not drink the tea until it was cold. She was not, she discovered, afraid. She had expected fear, had braced for it, the way you brace for weather you can see coming, and instead found something else occupying the space where fear usually lived. Something quieter. Something that felt strangely like the sensation just after you have been running for a very long time and have finally been permitted to stop. She had been running since her mother's hand went still in hers. She thought about that hand. She thought about the locket being pressed into her palm and the words that had gathered and not come, and the thing her mother had carried alone for 19 years, the knowledge of who Alara was and who her father was and what had been taken from them both before it had ever properly begun. She thought about what it must have cost to carry that. To look at your daughter every day and know what she did not know and be unable to give it to her because giving it might Bria. Everything and keeping it might save her. Her mother had been trying to protect her. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before, not as an abstraction, not as the kind of thing you tell yourself to make grief tidier, but as a specific and particular truth with weight and texture. Her mother had made a calculation the way women with nothing make calculations: what can I protect and what is the cost and which cost can I bear? She had chosen silence to keep Alara safe, and then she had run out of time before she could choose differently. Keep this, she had said, whatever you do, keep this close. She had been saying, this is who you are. This is where you come from, this is what I cannot tell you but am leaving you the key to find. Alara pressed the locket against her sternum and looked at the fire and breathed. At 2:30, Mrs. Aldred knocked on the sitting room door. It's time, she said. The great hall at Ashford Manor was used rarely and deliberately, for estate meetings, for formal occasions, for the kind of business that required a room large enough to make its own argument about the seriousness of what was happening inside it. Its ceilings were high. Its windows were tall and north-facing, which meant the light that came through them was the flat, unflattering, honest light that showed things as they were without the kindness of angle or warmth. The long table at its center could seat 20. Today there were 4 chairs arranged at one end, facing each other across the width of the table, with a 5th at the head. The Duke was already there when Alara arrived with Mrs. Aldred. He stood at the window with his back to the room. He turned when they entered. He had changed into the kind of clothing that indicated he understood this to be a formal occasion, not ceremonial, not performative, but deliberate. The deliberateness of a man who believed that certain moments deserved to be met properly dressed. He looked at Alara when she came in. The look was brief. It contained more than he intended to put into it, and he knew that, and he looked away. Lady Constance arrived 4 minutes later. She came alone, which surprised Alara briefly before she understood it. Constance was too intelligent to bring Birch into this room. Birch was a liability now, a witness to instructions that would not survive examination, and leaving her behind was the right tactical choice. Constance had understood this without needing to reason it through. She had the instincts of someone who had been managing exposure her entire adult life. She took her seat with perfect composure. She looked at Alara across the table, and then at Mrs. Aldred, and then at the Duke at the head of the table, and she folded her hands in her lap and arranged her face into the expression of a woman who was here in good faith and had nothing to conceal and was prepared to clear up whatever misunderstanding had occasioned this gathering. It was an excellent performance. It was, Alara thought, the best performance she had ever seen, and she had grown up watching Harold Voss, which had been a considerable education in performance. The estate manager, Mr. Graves, sat to the Duke's right with a leather folder of documents before him. He was not comfortable. He was the kind of man who managed comfort in difficult situations by focusing very intently on procedure, and he was doing that now, arranging his papers, aligning their edges, preparing to be useful in the ways that were available to him. The Duke sat. The room settled. I'll be brief about the purpose of this meeting, the Duke said. His voice was even, controlled. The voice he used for estate business, for legal matters, for things that required precision over feeling. Evidence has been presented to me this morning that bears directly on the accusations made against a member of my household staff over the past week. It also bears on matters of inheritance and family record that extend considerably further back. I intend to address both. Lady Constance, you will have the opportunity to respond to everything that is presented. I ask that you extend the same courtesy to others in this room. Constance inclined her head graciously. Of course, Edward. Mr. Graves, the Duke nodded at the estate manager. Graves opened his folder. The letter received this morning, purportedly from a household in Winchester attesting to the dismissal of a girl matching the description of Alara Moore. He glanced up briefly at the use of the name. The new name, the name from the register, then returned to his papers, has been examined. The firm named in the letter as the household's legal representative does not appear in the Winchester County records for any year in the past decade. The address provided for the household itself corresponds to a property that has been unoccupied since 1841. He set the letter to one side. The document appears to be fraudulent. Constance said nothing. Her expression did not change. Furthermore, Graves continued, the name signed at the bottom of the letter, a Mr. Gerald Hatch, purported former butler of the household, matches the name of an individual known to have provided paid testimony in 2 civil disputes in London over the past 6 years, on both occasions on behalf of parties later found to have submitted false evidence. He set a second document beside the first. He had done his work quickly and well. Alara suspected he had been doing it since 6 that morning. These letters, the Duke said to Constance, were submitted through your correspondence channel. The introductory note accompanying them was in your hand. I received them from a source I believe to be reliable, Constance said. Her voice was measured, unruffled. If the documents are fraudulent, I am as deceived as anyone. You received them, the Duke said, from a solicitor's firm in London with whom you have conducted personal business for 11 years according to the firm's own records which Mr. Graves has obtained. He paused. That is not the profile of a source taken on faith. The first crack, so small as to be almost invisible, a slight adjustment around the eyes, a fractional recalibration of the composure. Constance had not known about the firm's records. She had not anticipated that Graves would move that quickly. She adapted. Constance always adapted. Edward, she said, with the gentle, sorrowful tone of a woman being unfairly accused, I think you are allowing an unusual emotional circumstance to color your assessment of a situation that. Mrs. Aldred, the Duke said. Mrs. Aldred opened the notebook. She read from it directly and without preamble, the entry in her midwife's register, dated, precise, recording the birth of a girl child to Catherine Moore on the 14th of March, with the father's name listed at the mother's explicit request. Her voice was steady throughout. She did not look at Constance. She did not look at Alara. She looked at the page and read what was written there with the same focused attention she brought to the household accounts. When she finished, she set the notebook on the table. That register, Constance said, and now there was something different in her voice, not the gracious composure, but the sharper thing beneath it, the thing that came out when the gracious composure was no longer adequate, could have been written at any time. A notebook with an entry can be produced by anyone with a pen and a motive. Yes, Mrs. Aldred agreed calmly, which is why I also have this. She removed the letter from her pocket. Catherine Moore's letter, written 6 months after the birth, in a hand that trembled slightly in places where the illness had already begun. Alara could see this from across the table, the slight unevenness of certain letters, and it moved through her like a sound heard from a long way away, the physical evidence of her mother's body failing while her mother's mind was still entirely present. This letter, Mrs. Aldred said, references the register entry by name, date, and content. It was written by Catherine Moore and sent to me at my address in Hampshire. It references specific details of the birth that could not have been known to anyone who was not present. She paused. I was the only other person present. Graves took the letter, he read it, he set it in the folder. There is also, Mrs. Aldred said, the matter of the locket. Alara had not planned this moment. She reached up and unclasped the locket. She had refastened it this morning. She had kneaded it against her skin through the waiting hours, and she set it on the table. It lay there in the flat north light, small and gold-edged and warm from her body. Open it, the Duke said quietly, not to Constance, not to Graves, to Alara. She reached forward and pressed the small catch at the side. The locket opened. Inside, on the left, was a miniature portrait, painted with the fine, careful detail of someone who had worked at it slowly, in private, with more time than materials and more love than either. The face in the portrait was a man's face, young, perhaps 25, dark-haired, with gray eyes that had been rendered with a specific precision of expression, the expression of someone who had not known they were being studied as closely as they were. Constance looked at the portrait. For the first time since she had entered this room, something genuine moved across her face. Not guilt. Constance was too disciplined for guilt, or had buried it too deep for it to surface easily. But recognition. The recognition of someone who had been prepared for many things and had not been prepared for this, for the specific intimate evidence of a woman's love, carried in a locket, kept hidden for 19 years, and opened now on a table in the great hall in the flat, honest northern light. The Duke looked at the portrait for a long time. When he looked up high, S face was the most open Alara had ever seen it. All the composure was still there, the structure of it, the discipline of a lifetime, but something behind it had become visible through it, the way a light becomes visible through a screen. She painted this, he said. It was not a question. He was simply saying it aloud in the way you say things that need to exist in the air outside your own head in order to become real. Yes, Mrs. Aldred said quietly. He nodded once. He set the locket down carefully. He looked at Constance. You knew, he said. 3 words, said with the same precise evenness he applied to everything. But beneath the evenness was something that had been contained for the duration of this meeting with great effort and was now contained still, but only just the way a river is contained by its banks in the last hours before the water rises too high. Constance looked at him. And in that look, in the specific quality of the silence she allowed before she spoke, Alara saw the moment she made her final calculation. The moment she assessed what remained available to her and what did not, and what strategy was still viable and what had been removed from the table by evidence and by that portrait and by 23 years of a housekeeper's faithful, patient record-keeping. Edward. You knew, he said again, quieter, worse. Constance's hands, folded in her lap, tightened against each other. I was protecting this family, she said. I was protecting William's son. I was protecting the estate and the title and the line of succession that your brother gave his life believing would be secure. Catherine Moore was not a child born outside of marriage, without acknowledgement, without legal standing. Bringing such a claim forward would have caused scandal, legal dispute, years of disruption. Where are the papers, Constance? She stopped. The room stopped. The papers you removed, the Duke said, the original documents, the birth record from the parish. The letter Catherine sent to me, his voice moved briefly off its even course and then returned. The letter I never received. The correspondence from the solicitor she engaged in the months before her death when she was trying to find a way to reach me. Where are they? It was not a question, it had never been a question. He knew she had them. He had known, Alara understood now from the moment he read the solicitor's letter last Saturday, from the moment he understood that the child had existed and had survived and had been findable and that someone had made sure she remained unfound. He had spent the days since that letter working out who. He had worked it out before he entered this room. He had come here not to discover the truth, but to make Constance face it in front of witnesses. Constance sat very still, then she said with the last of the composure she had available to her, I don't know what you. Mr. Graves, the Duke said. Graves opened the leather folder to its final section and removed a legal summary, prepared by the same solicitor's firm that had written the Saturday letter, who had been searching for Catherine Moore's daughter for 8 months, and who had in the course of that search traced a set of forged papers related to the Ashford estate inheritance through 3 intermediary firms to a single point of origin. The firm Constance had used for 11 years. The papers had been forged 6 months after Catherine Moore's death. They established through falsified records that the estate's succession was uncontested and that no prior claim, biological or legal, existed that could supersede the line running through the Duke's brother's family, through Constance's son. Through the boy Constance had been protecting. The boy who did not know and had never known what his mother had built around him. Graves laid the summary on the table. He laid the supporting documents beside it, one by one, with the measured pace of a man who understood that each page was a sentence in a story that needed to be read completely and in order. Constance looked at the documents. The composure which had survived everything else, the notebook, the letter, the locket, the portrait, did not survive the documents. It did not collapse. Constance was not a person whose composure collapsed, but it left. It simply left the way light leaves a room when the candle goes out all at once without drama, and suddenly you could see the room for what it actually was. What remained in its place was not guilt and was not shame and was not quite fear. It was something older and more tired than any of those things. The face of a woman who had been fighting for a very long time and had just understood with complete clarity that she had lost. "The papers were forged to protect William's son," she said. Her voice was different now, quieter. The performance was gone. What was left was simply a woman's voice in a large, cold room saying the truest tea. "Hing," she had said since she walked in. "I would do it again, you should know that. I would do every part of it again." "I know," the Duke said. He said it without anger, without contempt. He said it the way you say something that you have accepted and do not need to argue with, because the arguing is finished and what remains is simply what is true. He rose from his chair and looked at Constance for a long moment. "You will have until the end of the week to arrange your removal to the Dower property in Wiltshire," he said. "I will ensure that William's son is provided for, his education, his establishment, his future. He has done nothing wrong and he will not be made to pay for what you chose." He paused. "But you will leave this house, Constance, and you will not return to it." Constance stood. She did not argue. There was nothing left to argue with. She walked to the door of the great hall and she opened it, and she stopped for just a moment with her back to the room, and Alara, watching her, thought she understood something about this woman that made the understanding complicated. Constance had not been wrong about everything. She had loved her son. She had been, in her particular way, a ferocious and devoted mother. She had simply chosen to love him by destroying something else, and you could understand why without excusing it, and you could feel the weight of it without forgiving it, and both of those things could be true at the same time. The door closed. The great hall breathed. Mr. Graves began quietly gathering his documents with the professional discretion of a man who understood that the formal business of the meeting was concluded, and what remained was not his to witness. Mrs. Aldred sat with her hands folded and her face composed and her position in this household gone, and she looked at no one in particular and seemed, impossibly, at peace. The Duke stood at the head of the table and looked at Alara. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in that first corridor, with the recognition that had no name, except that now it had a name. Now they both knew what it was. Now the thing that had been moving beneath the surface of every exchange had risen to where it could be seen, and it was enormous, and it was true, and there was no version of the world in which it could be put back beneath the surface, and neither of them would have put it there if they could. His daughter. Standing in his great hall with a locket in her hand and raw knuckles and a level voice and 19 years of not knowing, and not broken by any of it, not broken, not diminished, not made small by any of the smallness the world had tried to press her into. He had not known, he would have come for her. She could see that he was trying to find the words for both of those things, and that the words were not coming, and that this was the most honest she had ever seen him, this particular inarticulate stillness, this man who was precise about everything, standing in his own hall with nothing precise available to him. She saved him from it. "The south wall of the library," she said, "still wants proper attention. Martha's technique is not equal to the task." Something moved across his face, startled, and then something that broke through the grief and the shock and the enormous rearranging weight of this afternoon, like light coming through a gap in cloud. Not quite a smile, but close, closer than she had ever seen. "No," he agreed quietly, "it isn't." Outside, the sky had cleared entirely, the flat gray of November finally giving way, at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon, to something pale and cold and bright. The kind of light that made the frost on the moors look like it had been put there deliberately, like someone had decided the world deserved to be beautiful for a moment after everything. Alara closed her hand around the locket. And for the first time in 19 years, for the first time in her entire life, she stood in a house that was hers, with a name that was hers, in a story that had been hers from the beginning. She simply hadn't known it yet. The conversation that mattered happened that evening in the library at 8:30. She heard him stop outside her door first, 3 knocks, deliberate, slightly too evenly spaced, the spacing of someone paying conscious attention to what their hand was doing. She opened it. The Duke stood in the corridor in his evening clothes but without the jacket, which was its own form of informality that she suspected he had not noticed in the process of arriving here. He had the look of someone who had been in his study since the Great Hall and had spent those hours doing something that was not work and was not rest and had eventually resolved itself into motion. "There are things that should be said," he told her. "I would rather say them tonight than have them wait." She looked at him for a moment. "The library, there's a fire there." The room was warmed. Someone. She suspected Mrs. Aldred, conducting her last acts of household management with characteristic thoroughness, had left a tray with 2 cups, a pot of something hot, and a plate of the good shortbread. Neither of them sat, initially, as though sitting required a kind of settledness that neither had quite arrived at yet. "I don't know how to begin this," he said. "You could begin with what you know," she said. "You seem more comfortable with what you know than with what you don't." He looked at her, the almost smile. "That is accurate." "Then start there." He picked up the locket from the reading desk where he had set it after the Great Hall and held it in his hand. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "I knew her for 2 years. She was employed by a family in Surrey as a companion and correspondent. We met through a mutual connection at a gathering I had not intended to attend and very nearly did not. She was the only interesting person in the room." He paused. "She was the only person I had ever met who could outargue me in Latin and found it amusing rather than alarming." Ilara said nothing. She was very still. "I loved her," he said, plainly without decoration. The way he said everything but this particular plainness had a different quality beneath it, the quality of a sentence that had been true for 20 years and never said aloud to anyone. "I intended to speak to my family about making it formal. She was not of my station. I knew there would be difficulty. I did not care about the difficulty." He set the locket down, and then she was gone. "Gone," Ilara said. "She left her position. I received no letter, no explanation. I went to the house where she had been employed and was told she had departed 3 weeks prior and left no forwarding address. I searched for 8 months. I found nothing. I eventually concluded that she had chosen to end it for reasons she had not seen fit to share with me." He looked at the fire. "She had known she was pregnant, I think, for perhaps a month before she left. I have been trying this afternoon to understand why she didn't tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "I believe she was afraid that if she told me I would do the right thing for the wrong reasons, that I would act out of obligation rather than choice, that she would spend the rest of her life wondering. She was not wrong that I would have acted. She may have been wrong about the reasons, but I understand why she wasn't certain." Ilara understood this too. She understood it in her body before she understood it in her mind, the particular logic of a woman who loves someone and is not sure she can trust what she sees in him and chooses the uncertainty of absence over the uncertainty of staying. Her mother had been a precise and careful thinker. She had made a calculation. The calculation had cost them all enormously, and she had made it with love, and both of those things were true at the same time. "I did not know," the Duke said. He said it simply, without defense, without the performance of contrition, without asking her to receive it in any particular way. Just the fact, stated plainly in the room where she had first read his books aloud. "I did not know you existed. If I had known," he stopped, started again with the true sentence underneath. "I would have come for you. I want you to know that. I am not saying it to be absolved. I am saying it because it is true and you deserve to hear something true from me after everything that has been built on concealment." Ilara looked at him across the firelit room and thought about what it cost him to stand outside his own composure like this. She gave it its due weight. And then she asked him the question she had been sitting with all day. "Why did you hesitate?" Her voice was level. "In the study this morning, before Mrs. Aldred spoke, the estate manager was preparing to send for the magistrate and you did not stop him, not immediately." He looked at her. He did not look away. "No," he said, "I did not. I need to understand that." She did not say it with anger. It was the question that mattered more than the locket and more than Constance's removal and more, even, than the portrait. He had hesitated. She had stood in his study and told him the plain truth and he had hesitated. She needed to know what that meant before she could trust what came next. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding how to answer rather than how to be honest, and she prepared herself for the disappointment of the managed answer. He did not give her the managed answer. "I was afraid," he said. She had not expected that word from him. "Not of the accusation," he said. "I had already begun to suspect Constance from the moment I read the solicitor's correspondence on Saturday. I had spent 2 days trying to find a reason to believe I was wrong about her because the alternative was something I did not want to know about the people in my own house." He said, "I was afraid because I had been trying for 3 weeks to understand why you felt familiar to me in a way I could not explain. I had been telling myself it was nothing, projection or coincidence or the kind of irrational response that occasionally afflicts even careful people. And when you stood in my study and I looked at your face and listened to you speak and saw another pause, pressing through something that resisted being said, I saw her. I have been seeing her for 3 weeks. And I was afraid that what I was about to do was not justice but something more personal, something I had no right to act on without evidence. That acting on it without evidence would be worse than not acting, that it would compromise everything if it turned out I was wrong." He stopped, he looked at her steadily. "That is the truth of it. It is not a comfortable truth and I am not asking you to find it sufficient. I am telling you what was actually happening because you asked me to and because I think you would know if I gave you something easier." She would have known he was right about that. She stood with his answer and felt it the way you feel something that is not what you wanted but is what you needed, with a complicated mixture of relief and residual ache. He had hesitated because he was trying to be fair and because being fair and being right are not always the same thing in the same moment, and he had gotten it wrong and he knew it, and he had told her so without making himself the subject of the story. It was the right answer, not because it was perfect, because it was honest. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right. It's the answer I needed. I didn't say it was the one I wanted." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not certain what I feel about any of this yet, about you, about what this means or what comes next or what we are supposed to do with a situation that has no established form. I have spent my life knowing exactly who I was and what I was and where I fit, even when where I fit was nowhere much. And now that's changed, and I don't yet know what it's changed into." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking to be your daughter in the way that requires anything from you immediately. Not a title or a position or acknowledgement in any formal sense, not tonight, not until I know what I actually want from this, and until you know what you're actually able to give rather than what you feel obligated to offer because of the circumstance." She paused. "I have spent 19 years without a father. I am not going to fabricate one in an evening because the law says I'm entitled to claim you." Something moved across his face, the expression of a man receiving from his daughter at their first real private meeting, a demonstration of exactly the quality that had made him look twice at her in a corridor 3 weeks ago. The refusal to take less than the true thing simply because the true thing required more time and more honesty than the easier version. "You are very like her," he said quietly. People who knew her always looked slightly overwhelmed when they said that. "She had that effect," he agreed. And this time the almost smile did commit to the center briefly, with the specific quality of a smile that has grief in it alongside everything else, the kind of smile that has been waiting a long time to have a reason to exist and is not quite sure yet of the shape it should take. He picked up the locket from the reading desk and held it out to her, not the way you hand someone an object you've been holding for safekeeping, but the way you return something that was never yours to begin with and you have only just understood that fully. "She made it, had it made, because I once told her something, a private thing said very early that she apparently kept." He extended it the rest of the way across the distance between them. "She gave it to you, that means it was always yours." Ilara took it from his hand. Their fingers did not quite touch. The locket was warm, it had been warm in his hands the way it was warm against her collarbone, the warmth of something that holds heat because it has been held. She pressed the catch and looked at the portrait one more time. The young man's face, painted with the detailed attention of someone who had studied it in the particular way you study faces you love. She closed the locket. "I'll stay," she said. He looked at her. "Not as a maid," she clarified. "I won't go back to the linen cupboard and the correspondence room. That particular arrangement is finished." She held his gaze. "But I'll stay for now while we determine what this is." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Mrs. Aldred. What about her?" Her position in this house should not have been surrendered. The circumstances that required her to speak should never have existed. If she is willing, I would ask her to remain, in whatever capacity she is appropriate. She has earned the right to name her own terms. Alara thought about a woman who had carried a secret for 19 years and delivered it at the precise moment it would do the most good, knowing the cost, paying it without flinching. She'll stay, Alara said. She would never leave a household with inadequate dusting arrangements. The almost smile again, staying longer this time. No, he said, she wouldn't. Alara fastened the locket back at her collar, not hiding it, not tucking it away, but returning it to where it had always lived, close and warm and central, worn openly, because that was where it belonged and she had always known it even before she had known why. She looked around the library, at the shelves that wanted cataloging and the south wall that wanted proper attention and the fire that was warm and sufficient. The Ovid, she said. On the south shelf middle section, it's been shelved incorrectly. It's with the histories rather than the poets, which suggests someone in this house has a very confident and very wrong opinion about the nature of mythology. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was, very quietly and against all the weight of the day, finding something that might with time become the shape of ordinary life with this person. The cataloging has been neglected for 11 years, he said. I'm aware. I noticed in the first week. She moved toward the door. We can begin on Monday. I work better in the morning. She was at the door when he said her name. Not the girl, not she. Her name, said the way you say someone's name when it has just become real to you, shifted from a piece of information into a person you are only beginning to know you are allowed to claim. Ilara. She turned. He stood in the firelit library, her father, still working out the shape of what he was allowed to feel, still somewhat lost in the territory of it. And he looked at her with the plain, honest face of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected, and was choosing to stay rather than retreat to the composure that had served him in every other difficult situation of his adult life. Good night, he said. It was a small word, it was the right word. It meant, I am glad you are here. I do not know yet how to say the larger things, but I will learn. Ilara understood all of this. Good night, she said. Spring came late to the moors that year. It came the way it always comes to places that have been cold for a long time, not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement, but in increments so small you almost missed each one individually and only understood what had happened when you stepped outside one morning and realized that the world had, somewhere in the accumulated days, become entirely different from what it had been. The legal process had taken 6 weeks. Mr. Graves had managed it with the same precise, undemonstrative competence he brought to everything, and at the end of 6 weeks there existed, in the legal record of Hampshire and the estate record of Ashford Manor, a document establishing Alara Catherine Moore Ashford as the natural daughter of Edward Ashford, 4th Duke of Ashford. It was a document, it was ink on paper. What it could not do, what no document could do, was give her back the 19 years. She had made her peace with this. Not quickly, not completely, not in any way that made the loss stop being a loss. But she had made it, the way you make peace with true things, by looking at them directly until they become part of the landscape rather than an obstacle in it. In February, the Duke had come to the library on a Tuesday morning and stood near the reading desk for a moment without speaking, which she had come to understand was his way of arriving at something he had been working up to, and then said, I have been corresponding with a woman in Hampshire, a friend of your mother's from before. She knew Catherine when she was young. She has writ to say she would be willing to meet with you if you wished, and to tell you what she remembers. Ilara had set down the book she was cataloging. Yes, she had said, I would like that very much. He had nodded, he had turned to go, then he had stopped with his hand almost at the door and said without turning around, She tells me your mother had a gift for languages, that she was teaching herself Greek the winter before she left Surrey. A pause. I thought you should know. He had left before she could respond. She had sat with that for a long time, the image of her mother bent over Greek texts in some small room in Surrey, learning the bones of another language in the same winter that everything was changing and she did not yet know how much. She had written back to the woman in Hampshire and arranged a date for March. The meeting had lasted 4 hours. She had come home with 3 letters her mother had written in the first years, letters full of her mother's voice as Alara had always known it, and also full of things she had not known, early things, the person her mother had been before she became the person Alara had grown up with. She had read them in her room in the East Wing with the door closed and allowed herself, privately and completely, to grieve in a way she had not yet been able to, not the compressed, functional grief of a girl with 40 shillings and a carpet bag, but the full and ungoverned grief of someone who finally had enough ground to stand on to fall apart safely. She had needed an hour. She had taken it. And then she had washed her face and gone back to the library and spent the rest of the afternoon alphabetizing the natural philosophy section, which was catastrophically out of order and required her complete and focused attention. And by dinner she had been, if not restored, then at least recognizably herself again. The Duke had looked at her across the table that evening. He had not asked. He had simply, quietly, ensured that the fire in the library was burning well when she went back to it after dinner, and that the good tea appeared on the tray without her having to request it. This was how they were building it, in small, precise pieces, one true thing at a time. Mrs. Aldred had stayed. She moved through the house as she always had, noticing what needed to be noticed, managing what needed to be managed, and appearing at intervals in the library doorway with the expression of someone checking that the work was proceeding correctly. In March, on a Thursday afternoon, she had come to sit in the library, not to supervise, just to sit in the chair near the window with a cup of tea and the particular stillness of someone who had been in motion for a very long time and was allowing herself, finally, a moment of rest. Alara had been on the rolling ladder with a stack of books. She had looked down at the older woman for a moment. "Thank you," she had said. "I haven't said it properly." Mrs. Aldred had looked up. "You said it. Not properly." "Properly is overrated," Mrs. Aldred had said in the tone of a woman who had definite opinions about where ceremony was warranted and where it was simply delay. "You're here, that's what I kept the records for." She had returned to her tea. Alara had returned to the books. It had been, she thought, exactly the right conversation. On the morning in April when she finally understood that spring had arrived, she was in the library at her usual hour, cataloging the natural philosophy section. She was not wearing her uniform. She was wearing a plain day dress, blue-gray, neither extravagant nor performative. It was hers. She had selected it herself. The locket was at her collar, not hidden. Fastened openly, the small gold oval resting against the blue-gray wool, visible to anyone who looked, requiring no explanation and offering none. She wore it the way you wear things that are true, plainly, without apology, because apology would be a form of agreement with the people who had tried to make it something to be ashamed of. She heard the Duke's step in the corridor at 8:30 and heard him come in. He went to the reading desk, looked at the shelves she had been working on. "Natural philosophy," he said. "Catastrophically alphabetized, someone organized by approximate subject rather than author, and apparently considered this acceptable. That would have been my father. He had strong opinions and limited patience for systems he considered pedantic. Alphabetical order is not pedantic, it is the minimum viable courtesy to future readers." The almost smile full now, as it had been becoming fuller since February, learning by degrees that it was permitted to complete itself. He would have disagreed, vehemently. He would have been wrong, vehemently. She set a book in its correct position. "I'll be finished with this section by Friday, then we're into the history." The history section is considerably larger. "I know, I estimated it in January." She looked at him along the shelf. "We'll be at this until autumn at the rate we're moving." He was quiet for a moment, the considered quiet of a man choosing his words with the care he always used, for something that mattered. "That seems," he said, "like a reasonable timeline." It was a small sentence. It meant, stay, keep going, I am not rushing this, neither should you, we have time now. She heard all of it. She was good at hearing what lived in the spaces between words, and she was getting better, specifically, at hearing what lived in his. It does, she agreed. She moved the ladder along its rail to the next section. Outside, the south garden was doing its slow, determined work in the April light. Inside, the fire was warm and the books were being returned one by one to the order they had always deserved, and the locket was at her collar where it belonged, and the house was quiet in the way of a place that had finally, after a long time, come to rest in its true shape. This was what belonging felt like. Not a ceremony, not a document, not a moment of arrival that announced itself with appropriate drama. Just this, a Tuesday morning in a library with a father she was still learning and work she had chosen, and a window full of April light, and the sense that the ground beneath her feet was solid and had been solid for some time and was not going anywhere. She had simply needed to learn to feel it. Truth does not always arrive on time. This is the thing to carry from Alara's story, not the vindication, not the legal restoration, not the satisfying removal of Lady Constance from rooms she had occupied by force for too long. Those things matter, but they are not the thing. The thing is this: the truth existed from the moment Alara was born. It was in Mrs. Aldred's register. It was in Catherine Moore's letter. It was in a small gold locket pressed into a dying woman's daughter's hand in the last minutes of enough time. The truth was always there. It had simply been buried and blocked and delayed and carried in secret by people who knew what it was and could not yet speak it. And it arrived anyway. Not on the schedule it should have kept, not without cost, not without 19 years of stone floors and lye water and invisibility and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been told by the accumulated weight of circumstance that they do not belong anywhere. But it arrived. It found her in the house where it had always lived. It found her because a woman with a notebook and a conscience and the willingness to lose everything rather than let the truth die with her chose the right moment and spoke. That is what truth requires sometimes, not just the person who carries it, the person who is willing to spend it at the moment it will do the most good. Alara got her name, she got her father. She got a library that needed cataloging and a locket worn openly and the slow, patient work of building something real with someone she was still learning to trust. She got the spring, after a very long winter, and she had earned every day of it. If this story moved you, if you felt something when Mrs. Aldred stood up in that room and chose truth over security, then I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever risked something real to tell the truth on your behalf when staying silent would have been so much easier for them? Tell me in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Because truth always arrives. It just needs someone willing to carry it.